Well, good afternoon. My name is Justin Aaronworth. I'm the president and CEO of the Water Institute of the Gulf, and I have the great pleasure of introducing our lunch speaker, Marvin Odum. Marvin is the retired president and chairman of the Shell Oil Company and a former member of the executive committee of Royal Dutch Shell. He has a 40-year track record in the private sector, a number of many great successes, and his full biography is in the materials, so I won't go through it in great detail. What we thought we would do with the time that we have is have a bit of a discussion and then save some time towards the end for questions and comments from you. This was meant to be what they call fireside chat style, but since it's 98 degrees with 25% humidity outside, we thought we would just put some orange up in the back and not have an actual fire. So Marvin, thank you so much for being here.
Pleasure.
I wanted to open with a question. You serve now as the Chief Recovery Officer for the City of Houston following Hurricane Harvey. I was hoping you could describe a little bit about what that means to be the Chief Recovery Officer and how you came to be tapped for that position.
Okay, well, first of all, it's great to be here, and I have to say I am totally impressed by the conference here, and so congratulations on what you're putting on. I had a chance to go through the agenda and look at the deep content that's being discussed in all these rooms, and again, I think it's a tremendous effort, and it really signals the type of thought and innovation that's happening in this space. So I say that maybe as a precursor to a later question as we look to translate some of that over to Texas as well. So let me tell you about onboarding into this process. If you can imagine, sitting there watching television, 3 days, 52 inches or so of rain, watching all those scenes on television, which I know we all saw, the mayor popping up every now and then in one emergency shelter or another, looking at all this devastation and asking myself, how does this place ever get put back together again? And that's, pretty close to being literally what I was thinking when the phone rings. And I'm looking at it, and there was an unidentified number, which I typically wouldn't answer. And I picked it up, and the voice on the other side of the phone said, Marvin, this is Sylvester. Sylvester Turner is our mayor, doing a tremendous job there in Houston. That progressed into a conversation about potentially coming in and doing this. I did what I think probably most people in this room would do. I said, first of all, thank you for calling. Let me think about this for a minute. And I called a couple of people that I trust and like to get advice from. And they said, make sure the mandate is clear, be clear on what resources are there, all the logical questions, right? So I hung up the phone after 3 or 4 phone calls, and I'm watching the screen again, and there he is in another emergency center talking about, pulling people to safety. And I said, I'm not going to ask this guy any of these questions. I'm just going to call him back and say yes. And so that's what I did with the thought of just coming in and doing whatever was possible. I will tell you that the first time that we sat face to face, and this is probably the life, I'm sure Senator Cassidy can relate to this, probably the life of a very busy politician. The first time we actually saw each other face to face was walking into a joint press conference. Actually, the only time we saw each other after that phone call. He made his comments and he handed it over to me, and so then that started us on this, what is now a 9-month track.
Could you describe a little bit about what the day-to-day in this position is like, what the set of issues are that you're most focused on?
Well, I think, now that we've spent some time on it, you start to recognize, and I know there's some experience in the room on this, that you go through several phases in a recovery process. So there's the whole upfront emergency response piece. The team that I was able to put together really came in just past that. So start to think in terms of assessing what the damage is around the city, starting to plan and put a strategy together around those damage assessments, and then thinking very deeply about the kind of team you need. The way this comes from my corporate experience, but the way I thought about this team is the city of Houston is a $5 billion a year operation. That's the annual budget, and that pretty well describes the organization, that all of a sudden overnight was sitting on a $25 billion problem. And so you can't solve that with the same group. So a lot of the front end was structuring exactly what that team needed to look like, what components, what knowledge, and then making those plans. The second phase of this recovery really gets into thinking about how do you take that damage assessment and that need that's been identified and translate that into the way disaster funding works in the U.S. So this is a lot of advocacy. It's a lot of working in Austin in our case for the state, but also in Washington with all the relevant parties around congressional appropriations for disaster funding, but then working that all the way down to how that gets to a locality like the city of Houston. And I'll just encapsulate that by saying it's an important process. It's a tremendous amount of work. It's a lot of advocacy. It's a lot of negotiating, but it's a process that works. And it's you know, we've had some generous funding out there, not nearly enough in most cases, and I think most communities would say this, to meet the full need. But at the same time, recognizing 2017 was an unusual year in terms of disasters, and a lot of effort to get some money out there to help everybody. That third phase also has, I mean, that second phase also has a lot about putting the longer term plans in place. And then as you move into this third phase, which we're just getting ready to cross into, I think the main marker of that third phase is the money starts to arrive. So aside from the front end emergency FEMA money and the philanthropic money that's there on the front end, when the big dollars in terms of the grants to fix city infrastructure and that type of thing from FEMA, but very importantly, the housing and urban development funds, when those disaster recovery funds start to come in the door, that'll be August, September timeframe for us, so about a year after the storm. Then you're in execution mode, and then it's all about ramping up and addressing the issues as quickly as you can. I think I'll just give you one number, Justin, because I think one of the hard things to tell you, if you fly into Houston now, or even if you see things on the screen about Houston, it basically looks like a city that's completely back on its feet. And in a lot of ways, that's true. It's an incredibly resilient place. A lot of effort went into turning that around very quickly. But the statistic I'll share with you is, as we've gone through and now had time to assess the need and the data that's out there and the damage that's out there, we have on the order of 365,000 homes that were severely damaged by the storm. A much higher number than the early estimates that are out there. That includes multifamily homes like apartments. That's part of how you get to a number that big, but that's about half single-family homes and half multifamily homes. That makes it, if you translate that across the region, I think almost certainly the largest housing disaster ever in the history of this country. And so organizing a program to address that in a very efficient way with the money and be ready to go when the money arrives is a big part of the focus right now.
Well, we're of course talking here in New Orleans, a city that you know well. This is the state of the coast, of course, focused on, for the most part, Louisiana issues. We do have people from over 31 states here. I'm curious, you really helped to lead Shell's response to Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, and you now have this perspective and this remarkable set of duties and challenge before you in Houston. Could you reflect a little bit on the similarities and differences between the two situations?
Oh, that's a great question. I think the similarities are probably going to be pretty obvious to people. I mean, when you immediately start to look at and address a situation like that, just the scale, the daunting scale of the damage is the first thing that comes to mind. And as I'm looking around Houston for the first time after Harvey, it was very much that same sense of what I was both hearing from people coming out of New Orleans, but also our very frequent visits to New Orleans at the time. We had about 4,000 employees in the New Orleans area at the time. I think Shell still has about 4,500 people in the area. So extremely important, and virtually, as everybody here understands, virtually all those people had to leave at least for a while. So just the daunting nature of trying to think through how do you put this back together again is very similar. What I benefit from in having seen Katrina is a better understanding of the timescales that are involved. I think it probably put me in a better position to help people understand things like when will help actually arrive, and in virtually every case, it's much slower than people anticipate. It takes a long time, which is a point maybe we come back to at some point, because I think there's some opportunity there. And then the human stories, of course, are very, very similar. Mm-hmm. I think that, if you think about some of the differences, though, Houston is a city that's, well, let's go straight to the storm first. I mean, the storm was pretty pervasive across the entire area, but there were pockets that were reasonably well preserved, or you might even say are more resilient than other parts of the city. So as devastating as it was, it's a city with tremendous resources, and similar to New Orleans, everybody came out to help the very next day. But there were probably more resources to help with that were available immediately. And the city was able to get back to a functioning level much quicker, which is very helpful. Now, one of the things you have to be careful about with that is it's a little bit of a tale of two cities right now. You can drive through Houston and feel like everything's just fine. I can drive to my home and feel like everything's just fine. And then there are areas that are still, as you'll relate to, completely vacant, totally devastated, and whole communities trying to figure out how to get back on their feet.
You know, that's something, of course, that resonates here. We tend to find, whether it's in New Orleans or in other areas of this state, certainly other areas around the country, around the world, you oftentimes find that those who are most in need tend to suffer the most, disproportionately so, when you have a natural disaster like this. Could you reflect a little bit on your thoughts around this whole question of equity and recovery and how to think about that disproportionate impact to those in most need?
Yeah, and I will tell you that the way I think about it today is much different than the way I did 9 months ago, and it's simply credited to the education and what I've seen coming into this process. And I think it goes all the way from just transparency and understanding all the way to structural problems in terms of how we do things. So let me just, so the transparency and understanding is pretty clear, pretty straightforward. A lot of these communities tend to be hidden communities. That comes to the surface when an event like this happens. So these are problem areas that existed before. This need existed before, but it's just very much exacerbated by something as devastating as Hurricane Harvey. And the need there then is just that much more after the storm. So it's much more visible, and in a role where you're trying to address that and thinking through how do you get help to those places, equity starts to mean something very different than I think it meant to me before. On the more structural side, if I go to the other end of the pole, think about how a lot of the federal funding works, particularly as you're thinking about infrastructure projects that will protect neighborhoods and that type of thing. A lot of it is based on a verifiable benefit cost analysis. So if you're in an area with very high property values, high home values, and so forth, you get a very high score on putting in dollars to mitigate flooding in those areas. And of course, it's just the opposite in some of the others. So we need to work on that structural side where funding is limited in terms of where it can be applied. We're absolutely committed to doing that in this case. And I think, as we've been in discussions with the politicians that are involved and also looked at the systems very closely, I think I'm comfortable that we'll find ways to have an equitably funded recovery.
You mentioned the politicians who are involved. One of the things that we run into in Louisiana and across the country is the question of short-term gain versus long-term planning. And of course, putting points on the board, as some would argue, showing action, moving forward is incredibly important, as is having a long-term vision for recovery and resilience. Yeah. Could you say a little bit about how you think of that tension between short-term action and long-term planning?
Yeah, I think what I'll do is I'll skip over the parts at the front that I know everybody knows very well, which is when people are in trouble, there's no other priority other than saving people and getting them out of harm's way. But when you're past that and you're into a recovery stage, part of how we addressed it was we put together a set of principles, and there's 6 principles there. I won't go through all of them, but what I will tell you is that the intent here is to have a long-term vision in everything that we're doing, and that not a single dollar gets spent without understanding or being able to answer the question of what's the mitigation around the damage that was done. So if I'm repairing the city courts, which were heavily damaged in downtown Houston, they do not get repaired in the way they were before unless there's a mitigation put in place that when the next 20 to 50 inches of rain comes, the exact same thing isn't going to happen again. And I say this because we all like to measure storms in terms of 100-year, 500-year, 1,000-year. This was the third 500-year flood in the last 4 years in Houston. So you start to think about those type of things. So everything has to be mitigated. We all have a lot of complaints about the federal system in some ways, and again, I want to come back to that topic because I have a few recommendations. But the federal system is adapting, is actually in some cases leading on this mitigation front, with a real understanding that dollars spent on mitigation have a payback on the order of 5, some of the measures even up to 9 to 1. Whereas if I just go repair something the way it was before and then life can go on, that's basically a 1 to 1. So the mitigation focus is incredibly important. We try to keep that on top of everything. Another principle is that we very much are taking a neighborhood approach in the recovery because we want to preserve both the nature, the existence, and the diversity of the neighborhoods. Houston it's listed, I mean, some other big cities like to debate this, but it's listed as the most diverse city in the US that's a large city. And that's very important to us, it's very important to the city, so looking for ways to preserve that is key. But the other set of principles would be around the long-term economic viability of the city, which has to be the base of everything in the end. I mean, without that thriving economic engine, you don't have the ability to do all the other things that we talk about in a conversation like this. But then these middle set are all around quality of life. How do you make this a better place? And I say this in the context of long-term resiliency. How do you make a city more green, more connected, more livable? And there's an opportunity on the front end here. Again, we're talking about billions and billions of dollars that are being spent. How do you do that always in that context that you want that to be the end result? So, long-term resilience issue for us is affordable housing. And because of the scale of Harvey, it gives us the opportunity to do things that truly are transformational. So getting affordable housing and the capacity that we need in the right parts of the city that are close to transportation, and check off all the other important elements, that's actually doable now if somebody really sits down and thinks through the strategy and does the incredibly hard work to make those kind of things happen.
Yeah. One of the things you find in our group here is, of course, as I mentioned earlier, we're very focused on the remarkable set of challenges confronting Louisiana. Many of us spend time in Houston. Many of us were in Houston following Katrina. But for those of us who are not Houston residents or certainly know it as well as you, what are some of the things that you think we might misunderstand about Houston or about the manner in which the recovery is proceeding in its early moments?
Well, this place is unique. I know there's people here attending from all over the country, but when I say this place, I'm talking about the coastal Louisiana area, because you understand this type of event and this type of damage. But again, I think the thing that I think people will miss sometimes, particularly if you come visit, is this tale of two cities element that I mentioned, that the need and the devastation is tremendous, even though it's not immediately visible and it's a fully functional place. And that's the thing you have to keep in mind. I think the other thing people probably don't recognize about Houston, because Houston has a reputation of being sort of completely unleashed and unwieldy development and so forth, is that that picture is changing too, but that picture is changing in the context of long-term resilient economic viability. So, and I keep emphasizing that point because it's so critical. We're famous for being a city without zoning. And so development is done in a way that causes, this is the story, if you will, causes all sorts of flooding problems. A neighborhood that might have been safe at one point in time is now in danger because of all the development that's happened in the area. And so one of the things we're taking a very hard look at, and we've started to make the changes, is around how does development happen in the city of Houston. So that means changing the ordinances in floodplains, being very clear about the elevation to which buildings have to be raised. And just to give you a sense of that, the new ordinance that we just passed is that any home built in the 500-year floodplain has to be built 2 feet above base flood elevation. So that's a pretty severe test. I mean, now these homes are being elevated. If you build anything new, it has to be elevated quite significantly. A very important change from a long-term resilience standpoint. It will start to be reflected across the rest of the city, but incredible resistance to that change as well. It's amazing how hard you have to fight to make those kind of changes, even in the context of something like a post-Harvey event. But you need the right type of leader in place. The mayor of Houston is very committed to putting these elements in place. He's very committed to long-term resilience. So we're making those, not just in the floodplains, but across the entire city. So you'll see a remolded development format for the city, still absolutely preserving and promoting of near-term economic viability, but also in long-term, because you need all of this resilience to be economically viable in the long term.
Well, in a moment, we'll start to take some questions from the group, but let me follow up on a thread you mentioned earlier. I'm curious, as you look at laws and regulations and policy at the federal, state, county, city level, are you finding things that are working, things that are broken, that need to be fixed? Could you reflect a little bit on any policy changes that you haven't already commented on?
It's it's an important question. I think if you haven't sat in a seat like this, one of the first things you recognize is how do I say this in a positive way? How powerless you are in a sense. I mean, Houston's a big city. Mayor has a lot of say with what happens in the city, of course, but flooding is not a within the city limits kind of issue. So the number of jurisdictions that we deal with, if you just take Houston, Harris County, which is basically one large entity, and the watersheds that impact that area, you're talking about, with 12 different counties or parishes, almost too many to count jurisdictions, political jurisdictions, or flood control districts, or river authorities, and so forth. And to get to a long-term sustainable solution, you actually have to have all those parties at the table making the right moves in unison. And so that, it's not exactly the question you asked in terms of laws or policies, but that is an enormous effort here, is to bring that picture together. This will really be the summer's work. If we think about the summer of 2018, the goal will be to pull those parties together and basically develop a flood mitigation blueprint for the greater Houston area that will have a lifespan of undoubtedly 10, 20, maybe even 25 years. Will only be partially funded on the front end, so it'll have a long-term funding issue, but the need to develop a long-term funding strategy. And to get that done in a way, again, really difficult work, but to get it done in a way that it transcends then one administration to the other as all of the, the heads of these various jurisdictions trade out. Well, so that's one element.
Well, I must say, as you've been talking, and we'll start to, I think we have some microphones around, so please raise your hand. And while Jimmy and I think Amy is walking around with microphones, I'll just tell you, listening to you, a lot of this resonates. A lot of this resonates deeply, both in the city of New Orleans and more broadly, what we're trying to do along coastal Louisiana with the leadership of our colleagues from the Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority. It's not easy work, but if you look at it over a period of time, the progress is very clear. So we're all with you 100%.
I appreciate that. Let me maybe just make one comment before the question comes up, because again, I'm a big fan of Senator Cassidy, so I want to say this while he's in the room for a reason, because, and by the way, in my opinion, you're very fortunate to have this senator there, because there aren't that many people that I meet that want to understand issues as deeply science-based and otherwise as the senator does. And so let me get to the one opportunity I think I see, the big opportunity I think I see on the federal level, is based on the 2017 experience around this country. I do think post-mortem of that would be the opportunity to sit down and redesign disaster recovery from the top to the bottom. So from the federal government, from Congress, all the way to how a particular homeowner is helped by that. It all works. It's extremely complicated, all for good reasons, meaning protections were put in place as abuses took place over the decades and so forth. But I do think now is the time to have a redesign of that entire system. And basically where money to the ground takes about a year to 14 months now, I think an easy goal would be to cut that in half. So enough of that one.
Robin?
Great. I'm Robin Barnes, and I work for Greater New Orleans, Inc., so we're the Regional Economic Development Alliance, similar to Greater Houston Partnership would be sort of our analog. I'm really curious, from the economic development perspective, we are an organization that has gotten very involved in environmental resilience, whether it's urban, water management, green infrastructure, or coastal restoration. And I'm curious to know what your thoughts are on sort of where the environment and the economy intersect. And as you're thinking about the recovery, how are the business leaders and business community involved in those discussions?
Great, thanks, Robin. Yeah, so extremely important, and I would say getting to the point, Robin, where it's almost seamless. So as I think about the conversations that we're having, whether it's affordable housing or education, even as part of Harvey, but certainly bigger than Harvey, and absolutely in terms of flood mitigation across the region. The one group that's always in the room there with me is the Greater Houston Partnership, which is basically our business community organization in the city of Houston. And it's that group, and I'll tell you the other group that's always there is the very strong philanthropic sort of thought leader group that represents the city in so many ways as well. The city by itself can't get this done. And so looking at those local partners, and then you could go broader than that, of course, to identify others, but working with that in a very seamless fashion is an absolute must.
We have another question from Robin Keegan. Right, the Robin.
We thought we'd bring the Robins up.
Robins.
We come
The
together.
Robins are here.
So thank you so much. You actually answered my question, but I just wanted to, if you're still here tomorrow, invite you to a panel that I'm leading really to answer that question. I agree with you. I think the federal system can do this a lot faster. And there are really mechanisms in place. So even if you're not here tomorrow, we'd love to follow up with you because I am one of those people that used to sit in your shoes. I used to run the Louisiana Recovery Authority, and so have been, spending the years since that working with communities across the country, including New York State, the U.S. Virgin Islands currently, to really think through how can we do this better and faster.
Great.
So thank you so much.
No, I won't be here tomorrow, but I'm not hard to get a hold of,
Okay,
so
great.
I look forward to hearing from you.
John, you have a question? This room's taken over, this side's taken over. John Lopez.
I'll give you another secret. If you ever end up in a job like this, and you get the question of what are we going to have to pay you to do this, I know the answer is $1 a year. And because then when the mayor consistently threatens to cut my pay in half, which he does about once a week, it doesn't change your decision, right? So that's an important aspect.
John Lopez with the Lake Pontchartrain Basin Foundation. And let me say, first of all, it's really appreciate your kind of thoughtful analysis, and I think Houston is very lucky to have you on board. There's a couple other commonalities between Louisiana and Texas, our subtropical climate, also petrochemical industry. I'm just, in Louisiana, there are still some latent sensitivity to discussions revolving around resilience and climate change. So I'm just wondering, in Houston and basically in these discussions of resilience, which is great you guys are looking at, meaning how is climate change being part of that discussion going forward? Thank you.
Thank you. It's a great question, and I'm glad we're going to touch on this topic. So as I'm presenting to whether it's the city council or some other interested group out there, one of the charts that I show is basically the increasing frequency and intensity of big storm events like what we're talking about here. In this country, which is always kind of the view that gets the most interest, but around the world, it seems to be a very similar thing. That's a very striking chart. And it forces you, I think if you're doing this kind of process well, it forces you to answer the question, what are you planning for? And it brings up the right kind of conversations in this case, in the city of Houston environment, so that you can be clear on what you're planning for. And I will tell you, there are many, many different groups, but there's at least two obvious ones. One is, this is a signal of how much things are changing, and we need to prepare for much more. And there's a very, strong and fairly well-populated group out there that says Harvey was a complete one-off, never happen again. Don't give me guidelines around that because they're too expensive and that's never going to happen again. So you have to have that debate. We're very much on the first one, which is think of Harvey as a new baseline. Doesn't mean the exact number of 52 inches of rain is important, but think about that as a baseline. And as we're doing our planning and as we're thinking about resilience, it's that level plus a safety factor on top to account for future increasing intensity of storms and that type of thing. I think the other interesting aspect, so hopefully that answers your question, that is in the climate change context, by the way. So I think the other interesting thing that comes up, it's related to that conversation, is that you always get this really intense focus on what just happened. So this was a rainfall event for us. So we had lots of riverine flooding because we're basically a city of bayous. And we had flooding in areas where we just had pooling because of inadequate drainage and so forth. That's not the worst scenario for Houston that's very credible for today. The worst scenario is something, maybe more like what you've experienced here, which is a hurricane that comes, from the Gulf Coast up into Galveston Bay and up the ship channel towards Houston. And that would make Hurricane Harvey look like an almost non-event for Houston. In terms of the surge that's impacted there, the amount of flooding that would take place, even if you didn't have that sort of rain, and probably $500 billion of enterprise value in the petrochemical industry and other industries along the ship channel. So if you're in the mode of thinking about black swan or related events, that's the one to really worry about. So part of our challenge here is thinking about flood mitigation holistically, and it's not just how do you protect against heavy rainfall. It's what do you do about coastal surge, which I'm sure is in some of the content for these 3 days, and very much looking at, we'll call it a coastal spine, or because Hurricane Ike was so close to that scenario, some call it the Ike Dike, but basically protection along the coast in terms of a surge barrier, as well as very large gates like you'd find in Rotterdam or somewhere across the bay to restrict that surge.
Hi, I'm Chris Delia from LSU. In many ways, the Gulf Coast is America's neglected coast. We really don't, I think, get the resources we need to understand and manage the Gulf properly. Is that something you would agree with? And if so, how do we deal with that?
Well, I think so I agree with it in this sense. I think they're not looking forward, but just looking back, there's an opportunity for, I think, tremendous education, even if it's been tried before, tremendous education of how much this Gulf Coast adds to the nation and how important it is to the nation. And I lived in Louisiana, I lived in New Orleans for a long time. I know what the issues, meaning the numbers and the impact and so forth from industry and natural resources are from Louisiana. And Houston has the same story, the biggest exporting port in the nation. 70% of the jet fuel comes out of the Houston ship channel. If you shut that down, you're not going to be flying for a while until you can reorient those systems. I mean, there's so many elements where it's economically and otherwise important to the rest of the nation. We need to find collectively a way to highlight that story and start to work it from that angle. So that's my version of yes to your question.
I agree.
Excuse me. We have time for one more question. Dr. Laska.
Thank you very much for this conversation. Given what we've been through here, giving it to us in the depth that you have been doing is very critical. We don't need any superficial conversations about this topic. I'm Shirley Laska, Professor Emerita at the University of New Orleans, 31 years there, but since 1983, working on exactly what you've described, the hazard mitigation, non-structural mitigation. And I would like to ask you to address your comment to Senator Cassidy because of his commitment to pre-disaster mitigation. You mentioned that one of the critical elements of the Houston recovery is for lower income residents to have new housing, and I would add safe housing with regard to storms, and also to assist landlords in restoring their homes in a mitigated fashion for storm resistance. I served on the National Academy of Science Committee that did 2 reports trying to figure out the affordability of mitigation and flood insurance, and we struggled you would have been pleased to see these professors scratching their head and not succeeding at getting an answer. So could you address your thoughts to Senator Cassidy about lower income housing and resident protection and landlord assistance to do that?
I will, and here's on those two topics in particular, here are my comments. For the money that will go towards housing as part of the Harvey recovery, and what I won't try to do is address the previous recoveries and exactly what parameters were there because I don't know them well enough. But what's happening in Houston now with the housing and urban development dollars that have been allocated, and we're talking about billions of dollars, is it comes actually with a requirement of 70% of that money has to be spent in low to moderate income areas. And so I don't know where in time that shifted or if it shifted, but that's an important aspect towards achieving that element of equality. So that and the right local mindset, I think actually the tools are there to do that now on the housing side. And I include multifamily housing and landlord issues in that as well. And we've also wrapped homelessness into that to that topic to try to make it part of to include that in the bigger solution. The area I worry about most is it's not just about building those homes and repairing those homes, it's about putting the structural mitigations in place so that the floodwaters don't come again. And I always have to say this, the caveat that I try to remind everybody I talk to on this topic is those don't happen overnight. So, the biggest and the most important or typically have a timeline of 5, 10, even 15 years, and I really appreciate the Senator's comments on accelerating the permitting for that. I am concerned, and again, I might get a little out of my depth there, but I am a lot concerned with the cost-benefit analysis constraints that are put around infrastructure funding, because I think they can inadvertently ignore neighborhoods like that and populations like that. So we're working hard to, I understand in a single recovery, you sort of have to work within the rules and then you change them when you find the opportunity to do so, but just assume you have to work within them. We're looking for ways to mitigate that particular requirement so that we can make sure we have those mitigations in the right place. But fixing the guidelines around cost-benefit analysis, and maybe we were having this conversation earlier, maybe it's adding a social index, vulnerability index or something as part of that measure that allows you to put money in the right place. So I'm worried about that in the federal money for mitigation. I think, although this is the part where I might be out of my depth a bit, that I'm very worried about that in terms of how the Corps is instructed to do its work, because they have so much responsibility for these big flood mitigation projects. So my current sense is that that's a bit of an issue. So we ought to look more deeply into that one. And it's not only that, I think given the importance of what the Corps does, the Army Corps of Engineers does for this area, has to do for the Houston area now, it gets a lot of bad rap, and this is always about bad systems and mechanics. It's not about bad people, but it gets a bad rap in terms of opaqueness, in terms of funding, lots of opaqueness in terms of priorities and in pace. And I think there's a huge opportunity just to clean that whole system up and have these national priority projects clearly identified and prioritized and funded, at least to a degree, but clearly, transparently funded to whatever degree, as part of the Army Corps of Engineers program, so that everybody can have confidence in terms of when and how those are moving forward. I think that's a huge opportunity.
Well, as we begin to wrap up, I really want to thank you for being here and sharing your insights with us. I think I speak for everyone here when I say that the lessons that we've learned in Louisiana, what we're talking about over today and the next 2 days, we are eager to have the opportunity to share that knowledge and lessons learned with you and do whatever we can to be helpful. So thank you for taking the time. Please join me in thanking Marvin Odum.
Thank you.
Thank you.